Hello friends, welcome back to Cosmopolitan Cornbread. So today I'm going to do another kind of cooking 101 home ec with Constance video. And for this lesson we're going to be talking about baking cookies. I'm going to share a recipe I've been making for over 30 years with all of you, as well as some of my own personal tips for when it comes to baking cookies. Things that will save you a little bit of time and get all of your cookies baked in short order. The recipe that I'm going to be sharing with all of you is for old-fashioned pumpkin cookies. And like I said, I've been making this recipe for over 30 years. My kids all grew up eating these cookies. And if you like pumpkin bread, you are going to love these cookies. Now, this recipe on my website makes 5 dozen cookies, but of course we are empty nesters and I don't consume a lot of sugar, and so I'm going to cut this recipe in half, and I figured 2.5 dozen cookies would be more than enough for what I need. So I'm going to get out all of the ingredients that I need. I'm going to preheat my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we'll get started. Now, before we start the recipe, I'm going to talk about what we bake our cookies on. You can bake your cookies on a baking sheet like this, or you can use a baking stone. And I prefer to use a baking stone because I think it's easier to bake on. However, I'll talk about that when we get to the actual cookie shaping. But because this is stoneware, I want to preheat this as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stick it in my oven and let it warm up while the oven is heating. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and chop my pecans. This recipe calls for 1 cup, so I'm going to need about 1/2 cup of chopped pecans. And because my pecans aren't already chopped, I have pieces in here, I'm just going to go ahead and chop them up. That way they're ready when it comes time to put them into the recipe. And I'm just going to start chopping up my pecans. Now, you can buy pecans, of course, already chopped, but I find that if I purchase the pecan pieces and just chop them up myself, it's a little more economical. Pecan pieces usually cost less than chopped pecans. And again, we're making cookies, so we don't want pieces that are too big. All right, I'm going to need a few more. And if you're curious about the knife and the cutting board that I'm using, I have a video where I talk all about this knife, what it's called, the history of it. I will put a link to that in the video description if you are interested. Alright, there we go, 1/2 cup of chopped pecans. So I've pulled out my electric mixer because cookie dough can be pretty thick and it's really hard to mix up by hand. You can do it by hand, but using an electric mixer, whether it's a stand mixer or a handheld one, makes it much easier to make your cookie dough. So I'm going to start by measuring out my dry ingredients. This recipe calls for 5 cups of all-purpose flour, but I'm only going to use 2.5 since I'm doing a half recipe. One, two, and 1/2. The recipe calls for 2 teaspoons each of baking powder and baking soda, so we'll need 1 of each. powder. Baking soda. Next, the recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. We'll need 1. Now I've got baking soda all over my measuring spoon, so I'm just going to take a cloth and wipe that off. One teaspoon. 1½ teaspoon of ground nutmeg, means 3/4 of a teaspoon for us. A teaspoon of salt, means 1/2 teaspoon for us. And that is all of the dry ingredients. So I'm just going to take a whisk and I'm going to stir this all together until it's combined. Okay. So now we'll just set this aside for a minute. Next, the recipe calls for 1 cup or 2 sticks of unsalted butter that's room temperature. Now, I just pulled my butter out of the refrigerator right before I started making this recipe, and so the butter was very cold. I had not taken it out to let it warm up. Here's a trick for warming up butter to make it room temperature without having to use a microwave. Take your stick of butter, take a mason jar, a pint or a quart. A quart would actually work a little bit better. However, I used a pint-sized jar. Fill it with very hot water, nearly boiling. Let the hot water sit in there for up to a minute. Pour the water out and set the hot jar over the stick of butter. After about 45 seconds to a minute, flip the butter over so the other end is standing up, and in just a couple of minutes you have perfectly soft room temperature butter and no microwave needed. So in the mixing bowl we're going to need our butter, 2 sticks if you were doing the full recipe. I'm only doing a half, so I only need 1. We're going to put the soft butter in there. I'm going to keep my wrapper for when I need to butter some pans. I'll stick this in my baggie in the fridge. And you can use that butter wrapper for more than just baking. You can also rub butter on your skillet when you are frying an egg. We're going to need granulated sugar. The recipe calls for 2½ cups, so we'll only need 1 1/4. I'm going to put my paddle attachment onto my mixer, and we're going to beat the butter and the sugar together until they are fluffy and creamy. Next, we're going to need 1 cup of pumpkin. This is solid packed pumpkin or pumpkin puree. You can make a homemade version out of fresh pumpkins. I have a video where I teach you how to do that. I'll link that down below as well. The recipe calls for 2 cups, but again, we'll only need 1. You want to press it down in there. Make sure you don't have any air pockets, because if you have air pockets, you're not going to actually have a whole cup. Okay. All right. 1 cup of pumpkin. Gonna add that in. And the recipe calls for 2 eggs. We will only need 1. Add that. We're going to mix these together. Okay. Then the recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. Of course, we will only need 1 teaspoon. By the way, if you do a lot of baking in the wintertime, now would be a great time to start some homemade vanilla extract. I have the instructions for that on my website. All right, we're going to stir in the vanilla extract. Okay. And now we're going to add our dry ingredients into the pumpkin mixture. I'm just going to add in about half of it at first. Start the mixer slowly so you don't have flour going everywhere. Okay, we'll add in the other half. Now, even though the paddle attachment that I put on my mixer has a rubber blade on the side to scrape the bowl as it mixes everything together, some of the ingredients will still come up on the side of the bowl. And so I want to take a rubber spatula or scraper and make sure that all of those ingredients get down into the dough. And now the last thing we need to do is stir in our chopped pecans. Now, if you don't like pecans, you could also use walnuts, or you could leave the nuts out of these cookies. But we love pecans, and I think pumpkin and pecan just go hand in hand together. So we're just going to stir those in. Of course, you could do this with the mixer as well. Now, one of the things about baking cookies that makes it take so long is that for the most part, you can only cook 1 pan of cookies at a time. So one of the things that makes my baking time much quicker is parchment paper and cooling racks. I'll take a piece of parchment paper, I'll lay it out on top of one of the cooling racks, scoop the cookie dough or dough balls, whatever kind of cookies it is that I'm making, onto the parchment paper, and then I will slide that parchment paper onto my hot baking stone or baking sheet. While that one is baking, I'll go ahead and prepare another sheet of parchment paper with another pan full of cookies. When the first pan full is done baking, I slide that sheet of parchment paper out onto a cooling rack, slide the prepared one into the oven on the hot stone or pan, and just repeat the process. It allows the cookies to cool down much faster because they're not on a hot pan or stone. And some recipes require cookies to actually cool without being moved. And so because they're on parchment paper, they're going to cool down much, much faster. And there's no waiting in between with the oven going while you're preparing the next pan. This just cuts the time for cookie baking significantly. Now this recipe calls for the cookie dough to be measured out in rounded tablespoons. And I have a scoop that is a cookie dough scoop that is that exact size. And one of the reasons that I like using scoops is that I get a consistent size with all of my cookies, and the little blade that is in there helps scoop the cookie dough out onto the pan much more easily. Now, if you don't have one of these scoops, you can still, of course, make cookies. You would just scoop the dough out with a spoon, use a little spatula to scrape it off onto the pan, and just measure out the cookie dough that way. All right, my first sheet of cookies is ready. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pull my hot baking stone out. I'll slide my cookies onto the hot stone very carefully, and then we'll put this back into the oven. These cookies bake for 18 to 20 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and set my timer for 18 minutes. Now, I don't usually pull the stone out of the oven to put the sheet of cookies on there. I usually just slide them out and in while the stone or the baking sheet is still in there, but I have a lot of practice doing that. So you can do that if you choose to, but just be very careful because remember, the stone and your oven are very hot. So while that first pan of cookies is baking, I'm going to go ahead and prepare my next sheet of cookie dough. And then while we're waiting for these to finish up, I'll go ahead and wash my dishes. Alright, so these cookies are ready to come out. So I'm going to take my sheet here very carefully. Again, I am very practiced at doing this. And I'm going to grab the sheet and I'm going to slide it out onto my rack. Just like that. And we're going to take the next sheet and slide it in. All right, I'm going to take all my cookies now and I'm going to set them over here on a third cooling rack. And now I'm just going to scoop out the dough and get this sheet ready again. Now I am very practiced at sliding parchment paper full of cookie dough in and out of the oven. And so you see me grabbing the parchment paper with my fingers. However, if you are not practiced with it or the hot pans make you a little bit nervous, I would recommend grabbing the parchment paper with a pair of tongs and just sliding it out onto the cooling rack and then carefully sliding the next sheet into the oven. While the parchment paper and cooling rack technique saves time, I don't want you to use that tip if it causes you to burn yourself. We want to bake cookies, we want to enjoy it, enjoy the cookies, but we want to be safe and we don't want to burn your fingers. All right, friends, so that's how you make the old-fashioned pumpkin cookies. Let me break one open here so you can see the inside. There you go. So you can have the pumpkin cookies just like this, or you could also mix up a cream cheese glaze to drizzle over the tops of them. These cookies should be stored inside an airtight container because you don't want them to dry out. And they also freeze very well. I would freeze them without a glaze on them and then simply add the glaze later on if you choose to do so. You can find a printable version of this old-fashioned pumpkin cookie recipe on my website, cosmopolitancornbread.com. I will put a link to that in the video description down below. So that is it for today. Thanks for joining me here again in the Homestead Kitchen. My name is Constance from Cosmopolitan Cornbread, and I will talk to y'all next time.